Science Center, Science Museum, and we're going to talk a little bit about that here in a second. So this year, the Discovery is 10 years old, so this is still a relatively new and young museum. It was founded all the way back in 2004. So our founder moved to the Reno area for work and business. He was a serial entrepreneur, and so he lived on the East Coast in Boston and lived on the West Coast in San Francisco, great museum cities with lots of amenities. Moved to Reno, and we didn't have very much here. There's a lovely our auto museum a couple of blocks that way, and there's a world-class art museum down the street. But those weren't really conducive to families to do things with. And so Chris decided, well, hey, let's make a museum. How hard can that be? And so he got a group of friends together and hatched the idea, and he spent a lot of his own money on a market study to make sure that the idea had viability as a business idea, and sure enough it did. And so we formed a nonprofit organization. So the Discovery is a private nonprofit organization. That means that everything that you see here, there's not one penny of public money that comes into this place. We earn it and we fundraise for it, but there is no public support for the museum. That means nothing from the city, the county, the state, or the federal government. So, okay, everybody's excited. We're going to build a museum in Reno, Nevada. And so a bunch of other people start to get involved, and volunteers in our community, and major donors in our community. The people that they were missing were educators, scientists, and museum professionals. There weren't any of those involved in the creation of the museum. It was 40 people who said, how hard can it be to make a museum? The answer to that question is it's pretty darn hard, actually. So they went out and they looked at museums all over the country and got some ideas and got inspiration for what they wanted to make here. Here's what's interesting about that. They went to museums called children's museums, and they went to museums called science centers. And they didn't really fully grasp the distinction between those two. So let me explain that for just a second. A children's museum predominantly serves kids under the age of 8. By the time kids are entering first, second grade, their participation in children's museums drops off really fast. So everything about a children's museum, the look, the feel, the experiences, the things that they're learning are geared towards early childhood learners, really sort of 6 months to 7 or 8 years old. That's the principal audience for it. Really good children's museums will put on top of that things for about child development for the parents or the adults that are bringing kids in, but mostly it's for those little guys. Science museums, on the other hand, think about cradle to grave learning. We want to engage and interact with everybody that comes through our doors. Now, that said, about 75% of the folks walking through those doors that you just did are going to be families with kids, and probably kids under the age of 12. So little guys are still really important to us. It's the foundation of learning. It's our core constituency. But that means we've got another 25, 30% of our visitorship that we need to be thinking about. So we think about young adults, teens, high school students, college students who are maybe out of the house but not yet starting their career. Young adults who have started their career, maybe they're not married yet, or they're married but they don't have kids yet. And then also thinking about seniors, right? So there are the grandparents that come in with kids. We have retired community. And so everything about a science center is geared towards making sure that we've got something for everybody in that spectrum. What we did when we opened this museum was they took a little bit of children's museum and a little bit of science center, and they slammed it together and said, we'll just have a mix of everything, not really understanding the distinction between those two models. And what's kind of funny about that is every science center is a de facto children's museum because it is serving that audience, but it doesn't really work the other way around. And so the doors were opened here in September of 2011 with sort of this interesting hybrid model. And there was so much excitement and so much money that went into creating this thing. We opened the doors, and on Day 2, there was no plan for what happens next. How do we actually run this thing? How do we grow it? What else can we do with it? And so the organization went through very natural, normal growing pains that young startup companies go through. But the folks involved in it at the time, thought it was a crisis and the whole thing was going to explode. And so they went through a couple of different iterations. They had different leadership over the first 18 months and really sort of struggled. And that's when they decided to go, hey, maybe we should have somebody with some museum experience come in and run this institution. And that's when I was hired. So I moved here from the West Coast in Portland, Oregon, to take the position here in Reno, Nevada. In Portland, I was the chief operating officer at the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, a really big museum. It's actually the 5th largest science center in the country. It's about 300,000 square feet. We had a big exhibit shop, we had theaters, we had, actually, believe it or not, a submarine attached to the museum. We had all sorts of things going on. And this was a really special opportunity to come and lead what we would call a mid-sized museum. So this institution is what you will see and explore is about 70,000 square feet of public exhibition space. Our industry is classified by small, medium, and large. So, and that's driven by your annual budget, your attendance, and your actual physical size. And you take those 3 things together and that categorizes you. So the Discovery is a mid-sized science center. I took the position in April of 2013, so about 9 years ago. And it was with the understanding of helping the board and our founders understand the distinction between a children's museum and a science center. And I said, if you hire me, you're getting a science center guy, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to fully embrace the science center model. If you want to keep with the children's museum or a hybrid model, then go ahead, but maybe go with somebody else. And so they said, great, love to have you. Here's the keys. Come do it. And so I did, and over the last 9 years, we have seen some pretty big growth that's happened here at the Discovery. As of January 2020, right, important date and time, January 2020, before a global pandemic hit, we were seeing about 220,000 people a year coming through our front doors. That's a lot for a market our size. In addition to that, we serve about another 25,000 kids a year that come through a school field trip model. So every day, just today, in fact, this room is set up for some reserved classroom programs that we do with our field trips. We have kids coming in here on field trips. Predominantly, we're serving elementary school kids, but sometimes we will get some middle school and high school groups in here. Our annual budget, we do all that for about $3 million a year. I don't know if $3 million sounds like a lot to you or a little to you, but I can tell you that what we do with that $3 million is quite a bit, and you will see that when you go out and experience the museum. In addition to that operating budget, we bring in temporary exhibits. So we rent or borrow exhibits from other museums. In our 9 years, we've had 3 large traveling exhibits, one featuring Dr. Zeb Hogan, who's actually a faculty member up at UNR. He's a National Geographic explorer, and he studies large freshwater fish. And so there's an entire exhibit about Dr. Hogan's work called Monster Fish. And so we brought that exhibit in here. And there are some really, really big freshwater fish in the world. I don't know if you know that, but there's some pretty wild ones. So we brought monster fish in here. A few years later, we brought a T-Rex named Sue from the Field Museum. Sue is the most complete T-Rex skeleton ever discovered. And there's 2 versions of her. There's the real fossilized version that lives in Chicago, and then there's one casting of her that's actually toured the world, and we were able to have her here. We were the 46th museum to host Sue. So we've had a giant T-Rex in our building. And we had a great big exhibit called Mindbender Mansion, which is all about brain teasers and puzzles and interactive, collaborative team building and problem solving. And then this coming September, we will be bringing in an exhibition called Survival of the Slowest, which is features 10,000 square feet of exhibits about different adaptations that animals have in their natural habitat. And this exhibit tours with 12 live specimens, including the star of the show, a three-toed sloth named Flash, who will be here and on display with our visitors. And so part of being an interactive, hands-on science center, I want you to think about this for a second. Interactive, hands-on science center. That means, if we go down the street to the art museum and we start touching things, you're not going to like that very much. Here we encourage it. We want people to engage with what we have. We want you hands-on with the science and experiential learning. Now, think about your home, right? Think about your living room. Now, invite 200,000 people a year into your living room to touch your stuff, right? We have to think about that in the exhibit design process. We can create really cool stuff for the 20 of us in this room, but then we have to think about how do we design that and build that in a way that can withstand the rigors of, 1 million touches a year. That's sort of our metric. Any button, any lever, anything that gets picked up and touched, we have to think about that happening 1 million times a year, and the wear and tear that comes down. In the exhibit design process, the other thing that we have to do is we have to think about what's the learning outcomes that we want. So you will see each of our galleries focuses on a different theme, and in that gallery there's a mix of activities going on in there. And those galleries are designed with a very specific intent behind it. So, pick your favorite science topic, right? Let's call it geology. Got any geologists in here? Awesome, good, because I don't know anything about rocks, so I can talk about it like I know something. Let's say we wanted to have this be a geology museum. We could fill the entire museum on the topic of geology and still not cover everything, right? So any topic that we pick, we have to hone down really fast. What is it that we want visitors to learn? So we start from that place. We don't start from the, all of it. We want them to learn everything about rocks and minerals. We say, we want them to understand the 3 different kinds of rocks. Or we want them to understand that, minerals are anatomical structures, or whatever it is. We set a series of learning outcomes. That's step number 1. Step number 2 then is that we have to identify who's our audience for that exhibition. So typically what we do is we have a primary, secondary, and a tertiary audience. So the primary, in our health and human anatomy exhibition, it's called Inside Out. We decided when we built that gallery that our primary audience for that was going to be middle school and high school students. That's when students are taking their health education classes and they're getting exposed to human anatomy and more complex cell biology and health concepts in at least the US curriculum. So that's our primary audience in there. Our secondary audience for that was adults, and then our tertiary was our little guys. And so the mix of exhibits in that space reflect that goal. Completely across the way on the other side of the museum is our early childhood space called Little Discoveries.